The Middle Ages have been seen as a time of poor hygiene, particularly among the lower classes. Despite the absence of running water and other modern conveniences, good etiquette during this period required people to wash their hands before and after meals, usually from a basin. Cutlery was still a rarity for most people, making hand washing an important part of personal hygiene. Those of higher social standing had the luxury of more frequent baths, while castles, manors, monasteries, and cities provided better toilets with improved drainage, and in some cases, running water using the primitive combination of cisterns and gravity. The standards of personal hygiene during the Middle Ages varied from person to person and from region to region. This video will look at the general rules and expectations surrounding hygiene in medieval Europe. Villages obtained water from springs, rivers, lakes, wells, and cisterns located in the vicinity. Settlements were typically formed near a dependable source of water, which explains why many settlements were established in their current locations. Castles were often built in strategic locations in order to protect their occupants from attackers, and their interior courtyards were supplied with additional water from wells that had been lined with masonry and were sometimes accessible from within the castle keep for extra security. The majority of the more than 420 castles surveyed in the UK had an inner well, and a quarter of them had two or more. The well at Beeston Castle in England is an example of how deep a well shaft can be, as it measures 124 metres. At certain castles, like Rochester in England, a system of buckets and ropes running up the inside of the walls allowed water to be drawn from the well on each floor of the keep. Rainwater or natural ground seepage was collected in cisterns, and some castles had a system of pipes made of lead, wood, or ceramic that transported the water from the cistern to other parts of the castle, such as the keep or kitchen. An example of this is Chester Castle in England. To collect additional water, pipes were installed on the roof to channel rainwater into a cistern. In order to make the water cleaner, settling tanks were sometimes used to allow sediment to settle before the cleaner water was removed. Monasteries often included some or all of these features. As towns increased in both population and size across Europe beginning in the 11th century, maintaining good hygiene became a daily struggle. Placed conveniently near rivers or coastlines, the bigger towns were able to benefit from trade, as well as having easier access to water and better means of disposing waste. The urban population had access to clean water through canals, water conduits, wells, and fountains. Town councils were responsible for upholding certain standards, and they enforced sanitation regulations on businesses and people in the community. For instance, it was often required to tidy up the section of the street in front of one's residence or business. Nuremberg, renowned for its cleanliness due to its progressive council, had a total of 14 public baths, a common amenity in many towns and cities. During times of plague, local authorities took on the responsibility of removing the deceased from the area. Due to the scarcity of running water and the laborious task of obtaining a single bucket from a well or other water source, it is reasonable to assume that most people could not afford to take a full bath every day. Due to the expense of heating water, baths were considered a luxury and monks were usually only allowed to bathe 2 or 3 times a year. Even if a bath was available, it would not have been filled to capacity. Instead, the majority of bathing was done by pouring a jug of heated water over the body, rather than submerging the body completely. For extra comfort, a lord might have brought along a padded bath, since it was not always certain that one could find such a convenience during their travels. Most people would have contented themselves with a quick splash of cold water from a basin. With the majority of the population engaging in manual labor, it is probable that washing was a regular part of their daily routine. Jokes about medieval peasants' hygiene have been around for centuries, stemming from clerical writings that portrayed them as uncivilized. Despite this, it was common for people in the Middle Ages to practice basic hygiene by washing their hands and face in the morning. It was beneficial to wash early on because fleas and lice were a frequent issue. Vermin found the rarely altered straw bedding to be an ideal environment, despite attempts to ward them off with herbs and flowers like basil, chamomile, lavender, and mint. In order to maintain good hygiene, it was customary to clean one's hands before and after consuming a meal, as utensils such as knives, forks, and spoons were rarely used. People used to clean their hair by making an alkaline solution from a combination of lime and salt, much like soap. Cleaning of teeth was done by using twigs and bits of wool fabric. Unless one was a monk, shaving was not a frequent occurrence, usually done once a week or not at all. Monks, however, were shaved daily by a fellow brother. Since medieval mirrors were small and not very clear, it was more convenient for most people to go to the local barber for their grooming needs. The common farmer likely had a simpler goal when they washed up, simply to rid themselves of dirt and sweat, while a noble would have to take extra care to adhere to the standards of proper etiquette. At Cluny Abbey in France, monks had a designated area for washing, which included a lavabo or large basin for hand washing before meals. Records indicate that the towels were replaced twice a week, while the water was changed only once a week. Visitors to a castle or manor's great hall would typically have access to a large basin for washing their hands. To conclude, the modern depiction of medieval peasants as having a disregard for hygiene and viewing washing as a form of punishment is likely an exaggeration, as people of all classes did their best to stay clean given their circumstances. Despite this, when medieval Europeans, especially those of the upper classes, encountered other cultures, such as the Byzantines or Muslims during the Crusades, they were often outdone in terms of hygiene. In rural areas or on large estates, the peasants would use a cesspit to dispose of their waste, which would then be collected and spread on the fields as a fertilizer. In certain instances, a humble hut offered a degree of seclusion, and a wooden seat with a gap in it provided a certain level of comfort. During nighttime, chamber pots were used and then emptied into the cesspit afterwards. When there was no access to toilet paper, people had to resort to using hay, grass, straw, or moss instead. The privies or latrines in a castle were quite similar to those found in other places. However, the waste was diverted down a hole into a cesspit at the bottom of the castle walls or into the moat. On occasion, two toilets were situated side by side and their contents were drained into a channel, which was regularly flushed with water from a nearby stream. Toilets were often grouped together in monasteries in a similar manner. Cluny Abbey had 45 cubicles as well as a bathhouse that contained 12 tubs. In towns, those of higher economic status had their own private bathrooms either in the backyard or within the home. These bathrooms had a channel or chute that would direct the waste into the yard. In areas where the lower income population was more densely populated, households would often have to share a single outdoor toilet or multiple toilets that emptied into a shared cesspit. Constructed with stones, the cesspits also received any other domestic waste and were regularly cleared out by a specialist worker assigned to that unpleasant task. Rules were in place to prevent people from throwing trash into the street, but these were frequently disregarded. When it rained heavily or there were floods, it caused major problems with the town's sewage system and polluted the water supply. The streets of towns were often filthy due to the presence of horses, donkeys, and other farm animals being transported for various purposes. This combined with the presence of rats, mice, and other pests created an ideal environment for the spread of disease. During the mid-14th century, the Black Death was the most prominent of multiple plagues and illnesses that swept through Europe. Fleas which lived on rats transported the bubonic plague, resulting in a death toll of between 30% and 50% of the population in areas where it spread. Poor hygiene practices in the Middle Ages certainly contributed to the spread of the disease, but there were other factors such as an ignorance of the source of the illness and the absence of efficient quarantines. It is essential to acknowledge that many medieval cities, including Milan and Bohemia, remained largely unaffected by the plague, suggesting that it was not only poor hygiene and sanitation that caused its spread. Plagues and epidemics that appeared suddenly occurred often, but everyday places could also be hiding equally deadly risks. Inadequate food preparation and storage posed a major health hazard. During the Middle Ages, consuming rye contaminated by fungi resulted in outbreaks of diarrhea, which was referred to as St. Anthony's fire. Poor diet may have been just as responsible for the high prevalence of skin diseases as poor hygiene. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe.